How do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich?
Disclaimer: this story isn't as malicious as the other ones in the sub, but it kind of fits the bill. Back in high school I took a computer science class with one of those teachers that are actually passionate about the material and try to make learning fun. The first lesson he wanted to get across is how a computer will not understand what you meant to type, it will only follow what the code says blindly. His first homework assignment was to have us write a step-by-step guide on how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The next day, he showed up to class with jars of peanut butter and jelly, a ton of sandwich bread and a knife, and purposely followed everyone's instructions, but in a funny way. If you said put the peanut butter on the bread, he'd put the whole jar on top of the bread.
If you said stick the knife in the peanut butter, he'd try to stick it through the lid without first opening it. If you said twist the lid, he'd go the wrong way. It was really funny, and it got the message across to the point where I still think about it over 10 years later.
I had a teacher drill into us that computers are only as smart as the person that programs them and will only do what they are told to. I still remember that 30+ years later, but the PB&J demonstration would have been great.
See, if you really wanted to mess with him, have the instructions be as follows. State in a loud, clear voice, I will give 20 points of extra credit to anyone who comes up here and makes a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
I've taught this exact lesson. It's always hilarious. Works well with brushing your teeth too. Toothpaste everywhere. My wife used to write requirements for features back in the days of waterfall development. I used to explain to family members that her job was to translate from human to programmer, and then the programmers would translate from programmer to computer. She is still working for the same company, now in InfoSec, and, 15 years later, she is finding her job harder because things that she specified in particular ways weren't implemented in precisely that way, but shortcuts were taken. And, yes, she called people on it at the time, but was overruled. And now she gets to follow up on security incidents to figure out what happened and how people got unauthorized access, and she can say, oh, look, this feature was implemented in a way that it wasn't specified, and the deficiency was noted and deferred. For 15 years. I wonder if anybody saw this coming.
Let's look at the documentation. Oh, look. 15 years ago someone said this was a risk. I wonder who it was. What a surprise. It was me.
Some armies do something similar in officer training. Each candidate in turn is given the task of creating instructions on how to perform a simple task. The rest of the group has to follow the instructions but creatively misinterpret them. The goal is to teach the officer candidates how to create soldier-proof instructions. I remember reading a similar story before, where a college lecturer, on robotics, was attempting to impart the same lesson to his class. Our club, he doesn't have them making a PB&J sandwich. Though, he had them, as a group, create instructions on how to go through a door, as if the professor was the robot they were programming. Walking to the door, turning the doorknob, opening the door, walking through, and every time the class had a list of steps, he'd make them break it down into simpler and simpler parts, covering cases like round doorknob vs lever doorknob, and the like. Until finally they had what seemed to be a very, very long list of the simplest instructions ever for Professor Robot to open the door. A full flowchart of pseudocode. He made sure they were all satisfied that this covered all eventualities and was the definitive list. Then he said he'd begin following it in 1 minute, and sent a quick text message. A fellow professor then opened the door from the other side. Because of the text message, this completely threw off their code, as it had all been predicated on the door being shut.
This made the rounds a few years ago, and the way the dad causes his kid to segfault is hilarious. https://www.youtube.com/watch v=f.n. 2 Rumchkui.
I've done this for elementary school kids. For something like, draw a house, they get really sure of themselves with instructions like, draw a square, then draw a triangle on top of it, then get really upset that I draw the triangle literally on top, overlapping the square.
A good teacher, and I know you learned what he was teaching.
If you wish to make an apple pie peanut butter sandwich from scratch, you must first invent the universe. Carl Sagan, slightly misquoted. I was in a gifted children's program in grade 4. And one of the first things we did was get asked to read over a page of text and ensure that for the next week, we understood the meaning of each word. The next week they quizzed us. What does "and" mean? And the quote that threw us and reduced the big-headedness of some of us.
We had to do a flowchart about making a cup of tea.
I had a similar assignment in HS. Only we chose what to give instructions on, and I chose PB&J because it seemed so simple. I was wrong. And I think about it every time I make my kids a PB&J for their lunches. One of the common questions they'll ask at an interview for a QA tester job is to write detailed instructions on how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. They wanted to gauge how clearly and simply you could write the steps to reproduce a bug. I started teaching computer science as a volunteer in a local high school. I used this exact demonstration early in the class. It was a great hit with the kids, as well as the full-time teacher. I used it in every Intro to CS Class 1 taught after that as well. I'm glad someone found it useful and memorable, even if you weren't my student. As a bonus, I wound up giving one or two of the kids with food security issues a free breakfast that day. We had a similar experience in learning to write how-to papers in elementary school. The whole class was supposed to tell the student teacher how to make a PBJ. All 30 kids at once. I was in the back of the class shaking my head. My dad loved to misunderstand me, so I learned how to give very specific instructions. When we had to write the actual how-to papers, I was the only one across 4 classes who didn't need to revise it at all. I chose how to tie your shoes, and I tied and untied my shoes as I wrote the instructions to make as sure as I could that my instructions could not be misunderstood. Now that I am an adult, I wonder whether having my dad read the paper would have meant I would have had to revise it. This wasn't a coding exercise, but an exercise in writing and thinking. We were asked to write instructions on how to put on a coat for a person who had never worn clothes. The assumptions were interesting, the detail hilarious. My husband did programming at university. They had pretty much the same thing, but they had to describe making a cup of tea since most people in England don't eat sandwiches like that. I did that same thing when I was teaching my geometry class how to write proofs, and also with my 5th graders when teaching the importance of details in our writing. They seemed to enjoy the lesson. Sounds like a great teacher.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.